Welcome. Thank you for joining our CRM Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Larry Isaacson, USDM CRM Practice Director, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, how to avoid common pitfalls with computer system validation projects. The USDM team is proud to have Larry in a leadership role. He offers over 20 years experience in the application of GXP-compliant IT technology in life science organizations. Larry has experience in manufacturing, software development, and clinical and laboratory contract services management environments, and he recently led the implementation and validation of FDA-regulated global ERP laboratory and quality management systems. He has experience in establishing IT and quality strategy projects and change management programs. Larry has held the position of Director of IT in pharma, biotech, and medical device companies, and he holds an MS in Pharmaceutical Research Sciences. USDM is focused exclusively in the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing quality and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Santa Barbara, California, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 300 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market leader for validation accelerator packs. Our various dedicated practices include global quality and auditing, IT virtualization, life science cloud, UDI track and trace, GRC, laboratory, which includes systems and equipment, ECM, ERP, PLM, enterprise quality management, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, project management, and of course, the customer relationship management practice. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the message board on the lower left of your screen, or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post any questions there at the USDM group. We're happy to address questions offline as well. Just shoot us a note, usdm.usdm.com. Thanks again for taking the time to join us, and with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Larry.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Today's agenda is covering several topics that are very important for determining the outcome of validation projects. And from my perspective, this is something that underlines everything that USDM does in terms of being able to ensure for clients that validation projects go smoothly. And one of the most critical factors we've seen is not just the quality of the validation activities within a project, but the activities that preceded the validation, which determine the actual outcome of compliance in a project. What we want to cover here is the contributing factors to these issues, which are becoming more and more pressing in our experience. And in this case, rather than driving into one specific feature, we're going to step back and say, how do you think differently about projects in order to make sure that the endpoint, which is the validation in many cases, and the go live are as smooth, if not smoother than the system development process, which is often very difficult as well. So what we're going to be talking about here are the drivers and the symptoms of problem validation projects, the dynamics between validation outcomes and other IT constituents, which are many, the root causes between validation failures and project governance, consequences from these root causes to be avoided primarily, and how to protect yourself from the most common hidden sources of validation project failures. And that's really the key here, is that many of these are hidden, and unless you're looking for them, you might forget to take them into account when you're planning your projects. This is something we run into all the time. So why are we addressing this subject matter? There are outcomes to validation projects and IT projects in general that we run into frequently, and it's frustrating for everyone involved, USDM and the client, and often leads to substantial increased costs that weren't anticipated. Some of those that are the worst are the deployment delays, failures in validation testing, and substantial remediation efforts that go along with these problems that occur. And this tends to, more and more, is becoming the rule rather than the exception, unfortunately, as complexity increases, and we'll talk about why that's occurring. Failure to unearth system flaws which emerge upon deployment to production. So it's really disappointing to be in a position where you think you've done a solid validation, everybody signed off, and then you go live and you find issues while you're in production. Now, there's never going to be a perfect system deployment. There are, of course, bugs, and that's why change control exists. But in terms of the 20% of the issues that cause 80% of the problems, you want to be able to make sure you've taken care of those. And then even worse is when you have audits later on in the process when you're live and compliance gaps are discovered due to a variety of reasons that may not have been found in the validation testing. So this is what are some of the things we're trying to avoid. Often we see properly functioning validated systems put into production, and functionally they're fine. They work fine in testing, and in some cases they're working fine in production, except when you start using legacy data that's actually corrupted because data migration or interface issues were not sufficiently addressed. And then validated systems, you have validated systems which operate to requirements but are underutilized in production due to overlooked change management issues. So in some cases we've seen in complex systems the lack of awareness of the difficulties that are going to be undertaken to change systems in the change management process, or inadequate change management processes and SOPs associated with that, create a lot of confusion and can also create compliance risks for companies. So when we look down at what the root causes of validation failures are, we often find that a lot of these root causes have nothing to do with the validation itself, although they may be unearthed and affect the validation. Number one that we'll be talking about is overly aggressive project schedules. Planning and validation phases are often underestimated. This is not an easy thing to do under any circumstances. But what we're finding is that as companies are moving more and more aggressively towards using systems to meet their critical business goals, the project schedules are getting compressed at the same time that their systems are getting more complicated. And we have many, many examples in the public domain of systems being victimized by these types of things. So this is often a root cause for many poor decisions and shortcuts that are taken, which we'll touch base on. Lack of well-defined business requirements. Often that's an outcome of the aggressive project schedules. People may have a very large wish list. It may not have been very thoroughly vetted. It may be unrealistic. They may not be well documented. They may constantly be changing. And that all complicates not only system development, but of course the validation. We'll talk about agile system development methodology and how that's often a weak point for that approach. Then when you start talking about technical design specifications that are necessary to be referenced in the validation process itself to support things like data migrations and configurations and integrations, this is becoming more and more a black spot on many projects where whatever methodology was used to develop the system technically does not meet the standards that are necessary to be in place for validation. And finding this late is a cause of great delays, and often functional problems. And then, due to lack of governance, often there's a lack of business team involvement. Sometimes when you have validation efforts that are post-production or legacy systems, validation is a four-letter word to many people, and people would most rather avoid it. But these days, we need it more and more because of the complexity and the factors that are driving these problems. And business team involvement, the business owner involvement, not just in the system development and requirements, but the validation itself, is becoming more, is obviously critical to your success. If you don't have it, you have a lot of surprises at the end. QA team involvement. Just as validation is something that is thought to be more painful than the benefits in many cases, you find the QA team is often not involved until late in system development projects, either because everyone thought you wouldn't have to validate the system under the consideration, or because people would just rather avoid the issue. So often you see situations where a major enhancement is being led by IT. The business considers it a technical project primarily, and QA is not involved in the original discussions, and this often leads to surprises as well as the end. And then the lack of business IT and procedural documentation. This is all very crucial to the success of a validation. When they're afterthoughts, or they're incomplete, or no one's really thought about it seriously, these really create major delays in many validation projects, and also create surprises on the functional requirements side, where until someone sits down and tries to write the SOP or update the SOP from a legacy system or manual system, they don't realize certain requirements were overlooked. So why are these issues for the validation? Basically, the principle is that the quality and the outcome of a formal validation, whether that's a system, equipment, or process, can't be any better than the quality of its foundations, which in the case of systems emerge from IT and business project activities. So the bottom line is really validation readiness. How can you get a system and the associated documentation and the personnel and all the rest of it that's necessary to complete a validation successfully to be aligned such that you will have a smooth validation effort? You won't be having a lot of holdups related to remediation of things that were missed earlier on. So while we're talking about many things that precede validation, I don't want to ignore the fact that there are plenty of complexities within the validation process itself once you get there that can undermine a validation process, even with a perfect system. There are many examples that we run into where there aren't well-defined standards for the validation process itself and the methodology and the deliverables, questions about the formatting and the risk assessment and review processes. This is being contributed to by many factors, often with the mergers of companies or the acquisitions of new business units. You have multiple QA departments and authorities involved, and they may be having problems reconciling the different standards that they've approached. And for systems that are global and go across multiple disciplines and departments and divisions, this can become a real issue for sorting out what exactly is the bar for QA approval. We run into companies that have not updated their validation procedures or aren't keeping current with some of the most progressive approaches to validation, and that often results in a lack of a risk-based approach. There's many misinterpretations of what risk-based approaches to validation are, and we could do a whole seminar on just that, and I'm sure we have in the past. It's out there on our website. So you can run into a boil the ocean scenario, and this we talk about a little later related to the differentiation between UAT and validation testing. These systems, the scope that they have and the extraordinary amount of detail and complexity, if you try to address every possible scenario in the validation itself, you may never finish. So there needs to be a very well-defined process to assess which are the most common scenarios, what are the highest risk scenarios, with compliance and business risk involved. And then limit your validation to those and make sure you do a good job on them, because it should be supplemented by a preceding UAT, which we'll talk about. And then often, I shouldn't really call it a methodology that addresses business SOP development late. That's not a methodology, that's just an omission, where people have a lot of things in their head, but they just don't want to write it down, and by the time people start doing that, they have a lot of unexpected requirements pop up. So this, again, is a major pitfall in the validation process. Your validation partners should be making sure that SOP's development is in parallel, if not with the project, the IT project itself in terms of development, but the validation process from the very beginning. We often hear that and see that overburden. People point to the QA and validation groups that can't be responsive to business needs and become obstacles for business process for progress in a lot of people's views, because they can't review documents fast enough, they can't give you an assessment, things like that. Well, it's not really their fault in many cases. If they're brought in at the end of the process, they've got a lot of other stuff on the plate. They're not going to be able to take all that in instantaneously and make judgments for which they have to sign and be accountable to regulatory authorities. So while this may be occasionally a cause based on QA and validation group, organization and management, or multiple QA and validation groups trying to reconcile approaches to new systems, often it's because they weren't involved early enough to overcome those issues that is this root cause. And then you see the lack of partnership between QA and validation groups and IT and the business units. While there is sort of a natural antagonism that we see between validation groups and QA, as QA and validation may have different ideas about what's sufficient to sign off on a validation, it's usually because there is not a well-defined methodology that's driving that everyone can agree on, so the roadmap is clear. And then you look at document control and training procedures that are ill-defined or don't meet best practice. Ultimately, we need to be able to demonstrate that these are in place to have a solid validation for which is the foundation for maintaining the validated state once you go live. So we often find that the document control and training lags way behind other aspects of validation practices, may not be automated, and of course may have multiple systems, quality systems and document control systems within a single organization, and this can cause a lot of confusion as to what the next steps are. How do you get things approved during a validation? So when you add the contributors within the validation process alone, which is a short list, to the possible problems in the preceding steps, where a system, if it's not well scoped, not well developed, not well documented, with insufficient requirements, you can see how that can all pile up in the validation area, and then any problems within the validation process itself is just compounded by those. So we like to use a diagram like this to give people a sense of the enormity of the task especially for larger and mid-sized companies, to get IT regulatory compliance down. IT regulatory compliance generally is the pinnacle of a lot of different activities that have preceded it. The foundation of that is compliant administrative and operations procedures. Now that's easier said than done. A lot of thought, a lot of training, a lot of cultural orientation has to occur before these can be in place, and these types of processes, which have to be embedded in an organization, have to be driven through all the layers above it to maintain that IT regulatory compliance goal. So if your personnel management and training isn't reinforcing and supporting these procedures, if your general supporting IT infrastructure processes and architecture is not developed and documented and maintained in a manner that's compliant, if your applications which often mirror the infrastructure, are not managed in the same way. Your business IT applications cannot be compliant and often will suffer the consequences of many unseen issues going on in the infrastructure layers and in the personnel layers. And of course, if that's the case, with business processes becoming more and more dependent upon IT day by day, to the point where many companies wouldn't even know how to revert to manual processes to run their business for some of the most critical processes without the IT applications, then you can see how not only the business but regulatory compliance is at risk if these cannot be aligned. Now, there's a capability maturity model for IT practice, and there's also a corresponding capability maturity model for compliant practices within IT and the business as a whole. And these run hand in hand. So, and this is where they come together. If you have these procedures based on being higher up on the capability maturity model for regulatory considerations, then it can be baked into the practices with IT and push you up the capability maturity model for IT. But there are many companies that are doing great work from an ITIL and COVID perspective, but they're not thinking about validation, which is actually a higher bar to reach. When we talk about the hidden root causes of failures, this is again a broad set of lists here that I'll discuss briefly. But we have a white paper on the same topic in our, and we have a link at the end of this webinar that you'll see out on the USDM website, which goes into a lot of detail related to each of these contributing factors and their interactions. So we can never cover that here in a 30-minute presentation. So again, the root cause is often IT governance. IT governance is where the project plans ultimately are defined. They take their marching orders from IT governance, the priorities of projects, the resourcing of projects, the dates the projects are supposed to meet, which are driven by business requirements and business needs, but often are lacking the insight necessary to the fact that these are regulated systems. In fact, many of the times, these dates are set without any context in terms of whether this is going to be a regulated, validated system or not. When IT governance is not bringing all the people to the table and is not functioning properly, then it all flows downhill from there in terms of potential problems. And then that's compounded by IT and business culture issues. If compliance and validation is looked at as just a necessary evil and something that can be tacked on at the end, which is often the case, now we've got to validate this thing, what do we do? Then you're going to run into problems just as a guarantee. It's got to be something that's on everybody's mind at the start of a project, at the start of a consideration of a project. And the complexity related to whether something is going to be validated or fully validated or partially validated is increasing as people are moving towards more progressive methods of system development, as well as other aspects of outsourcing IT capabilities and operations. We see many times where agile methodology is seen as the silver bullet. We're going to develop this thing, test it in parallel, develop the requirements in parallel, and validate it in parallel. So within the time that we could think about the system and develop it, we're going to be validated as soon as we say we finished development. And that is all very nice on paper. But in practice, having seen the outcomes of many agile methodology projects, everyone goes in with a very rosy idea of how this is going to be so beneficial. And it doesn't often turn out that way, much based on why that is. But the majority of it is that requirements are constantly evolving during this process, which is great. From a pure system development perspective, I think it works very well for the users. But when it comes time to validate, it's very hard to validate a moving target. And often we see these projects get extended, and what was thought to be a cost-saving measure ends up increasing costs due to the confusion related to that. Sort of aligned with that is this mixing of UAT and validation testing efforts. So a lot of the rage seems to be now that we're going to combine validation testing and UAT testing, and we're going to basically create our validation tests and use them in our UAT during the agile development process. And then in some cases, we'll even do time slices and validate little pieces, even though we're still developing other pieces of the system. And that's something that really and it can mess you up, because the UAT scope and the validation scope are based on very different premises. The UAT system UAT test is really meant to explore every aspect of the system's expected functionality and all the scenarios and error conditions that could be expected to come out of it in a very organized manner. However, validation is meant to be based on risk. It is not meant to repeat the UAT. It is supplementary for compliance purposes. And trying to mix one and the other often creates a lot of confusion and often creates bloated validation efforts. Now that's fine for USDM, because we'll do whatever you'd like. As much of the testing you want, we can do. But the end result sometimes is not what people expected. Skipping UATs or combining UAT and validation sometimes causes a lack of critical testing to be undertaken because of the highly aggressive project schedules that are usually accompanying this approach. Configuration and test environment administration issues. This goes back to the technical side, where we often see people have not thought through their environments and how they're going to be managed and how many they should have. And that will vary depending on your scenario. Are you migrating from a legacy system? Are you starting fresh with a green field? How many systems are you integrating with? How complex is the testing environment? How many global regions are you dealing with? How many instances? So this is something that's often overlooked. We see people as well, because they're now moving to the cloud and they're interacting with SaaS organizations. They're being charged for each environment that they have. So we're seeing people just do a development and and validation environments because it's cheaper, and they think they'll use the production environment. The test development and production environments, I should say, and often skipping a separate environment for validation or for staging, for user testing, or for training purposes. And we often have seen that people suddenly realize they need a new environment, and it's a complex process to create it. On top of that, they may not have thought through all of the processes of migrating from one environment to the next, and the SOPs associated with that, to ensure that a validated environment is actually represented in production. There's a lot. You could do, again, a whole other webinar on that alone. From a data integrity consideration, when you have data migrations and integrations with other considerably complex validated systems, this is an area that people, again, often overlook. It's seen as a technical task. IT in the background is doing this, and everybody sort of trusts IT to take it on, but they may not have the business perspective needed to understand when there's transformations involved what the real testing criteria need to be. If this is as a second-tier type of testing activity, this is where you can really run into very nasty surprises, either in the validation or after go-live. Some of these cannot be picked up in validation, depending. You can't test everything. So if it's ill-considered and not well designed, you're really asking for trouble in terms of data migrations and data integrity, integration of the integrations themselves. And then these new architectures, moving legacy systems to virtualizations, to clouds, and more importantly, when you're outsourcing it to third-party providers, there's a lot of additional management necessary, and a lot of thinking in terms of the fact that part of my IT operation is being moved outside my purview, and part of my quality system is being moved outside my enterprise. And so what does that mean in terms of being able to develop this system, access to my data for archiving and retention, Part 11 considerations? These are now emerging in a much more robust way across the landscape that we're dealing with at USDM. And it's a very exciting and interesting set of problems. But not paying attention to them until the end of the process is often a nasty surprise to many people when they have to deal with a third party to negotiate how they can test and qualify their data or infrastructure. So this diagram just attempts to show a little more graphically that when you have these uninformed, dictated project deadlines, with the emphasis on uninformed, if they're informed and dictated, we're all used to that. But if they're uninformed, that becomes very problematic. On the left side, we have the technical thread, which, while I have it ending in an IQ, it also affects the OQ. On the right side, we have the performance side in terms of business requirements. You know, when these projects are highly aggressive or using new methodologies, we often see a very ad hoc technical approach taken. People are assigned quickly. They may not have a full set of requirements to deal with. They may be dealing with technologies that they haven't addressed before. They may not be trained fully yet. And so, and they may not have a very good regimen of documentation to begin with. This all can pile up in incomplete analysis and documentation being done compared to what the real need of the system is, which we don't actually know at the beginning of projects in many cases. You could then have partial or incorrect system configurations, which are critical to the ability to be able to not just do a UAT, but obviously a validation, since we have to qualify a system against that. You may overlook 21 CFR Part 11 features, which are needed not just on the system side, but also in the IT organization, in terms of how it goes about its maintenance activities, and the hosting organization if they're not the primary user of the system. And we often find delays in IQ and OQ executions due to these issues because of lack of documentation, SOPs, etc., on the system development, environment management, change control, you name it, data migration, and ongoing data integration management. Often become afterthoughts. If you have poorly defined requirements and the resulting requirement revisions as the business gets more and more involved, you're going to have functional specifications in the validation side that are incorrect, that have to be continually revised, which directly affects your risk assessment, your OPQ, when you can start actually doing the validation. And lack of SOPs due to lack of requirements, of course, they're all interdependent. And again, we need SOPs to validate against, because we're validating not just the system, but the SOPs that are going to govern it. So you've really got to be careful about how this can all pile up in the validation, but the root causes preceded the validation substantially. And if no one can hand us a set of requirements or allow us to develop a set of requirements based on really solid business input and IT insight into what's the nature of the system and the architecture and the configuration, we're going to have a very hard time completing the validation in a timely manner. The system is in flux, and the business thinking about how to use the system is in flux. We see scope changes happening all the time just before validation because of issues on the technical side, partners, etc. So this all adds to cost and time delays. And are primarily, and are avoidable in many cases. You can't avoid everything, but most of them tend to have been avoidable. So how do you meet these challenges or these hidden validation risks that aren't often apparent until you start trying to validate requirements? Well, if you've had ad hoc IT project governance with subsequent project shortfalls and documentation shortfalls, etc., governance is the answer to that. You don't have any chance if at the beginning of the project's inception and conceptualization you didn't have a compliance component being factored in, you didn't have a realistic schedule for what it takes to really think through a validation, if the system is characterized well enough to be able to do that. And if you improve on that, you'll have a much more realistic project plan and activities and compliance activities, both IT and compliance activities, that are going to make sense for the risk, scope, and nature of the project that you're taking on. If you're outsourcing it, then you need even more time to figure out all of the issues related to that if you haven't already done that. If validation testing is substituting for UAT testing, you're asking for trouble, as we discussed. We prefer to see discrete UAT and validation testing phases with a clear transition, a clear understanding of endpoints, and a delineation between what the UAT is trying to do and what the validation testing is doing in terms of focusing on risk and primer and the scenarios that it's meant to address. You'll have much cleaner validation projects meeting expected timelines. You won't have nasty surprises about functionality that was not properly tested or changes in the requirements as a result. And then in terms of environment administration, SOPs and specifications, again, what you'd like to see is best practice IT environment and code management practices with reviews and approvals. This takes time for an IT organization to both come up to speed on if they haven't been there, or even if they are working at a high level of maturity in the IT side, factoring in the validation deliverables associated with that can be very challenging. They need to be anticipated and developed along with the project. So your integrity of the system itself will be much higher and your validation will be quicker if this documentation is being created in line with the development of these systems. So there's an IT project and there's a functional testing development project in parallel going on here. And the compliance has to be baked into both of them. Well, of course, all this is easier said than done, and that's why we're here to help. This is just a very, very common thing we run into all the time, where the data integrity and migration and integration is thought of as a backroom technical issue, when in fact it becomes front and center when you're trying to go live. So we recommend that you really address this as early as possible. In fact, one of the first things that should happen when someone gets a project approved that's going to replace the legacy, let's say a clinical trial system, and move to a SaaS-based system, someone should be sitting down and saying, gee, how are we going to get it? Are we going to keep our legacy system where it is? Are we going to move it to the new one? Are we going to archive it? Or what's the retention period issues? How are we going to integrate it with our internal systems? All those questions should be right up front, even before you know the full scope of what the clinical trial system is going to do. Because there's a lot of variation within those. But one thing for sure is you're going to have to figure out what to do with your data and how you're going to manage it against your legacy processes. And then as you're adapting IT architectures and mobile devices, there's a whole slew of new technologies and approaches that are being tacked onto legacy systems as well as included in new SaaS-based systems. You really need to be proactive in your assessment of changes in IT architecture and devices by the business, IT, and QA. IT needs to get out of the habit of presuming a change is not going to be subject to compliance issues. We've seen it getting much better, but it's still out there, especially younger organizations that don't have the luxury of time and resources on tap to deal with this. They're very prone to say, yeah, worry about it later. I don't think this is a compliance issue. Doing it in a virtual world is just like doing it on a dedicated server. It's the same OS. We have a separate webinar where we went through all those excuses that we've heard about why SaaS deployments and moving to the cloud has been underappreciated. People are waking up very quickly to that, but it's just going to undermine you in the long run. And so you want a controlled and tested deployment of validated applications on new infrastructures and updated procedures along with them. So if you're moving stuff to the cloud or you're moving things to a SaaS provider, you've got different ways of managing those functions. They need to be documented. They need to be well understood. Change management will will be different than it was in the past with legacy systems. And we're all going to, when we validate, we're going to ask those questions. So, you need to be ready to be able to address them with documented procedures. When you step back and say, well, the analog for the dependencies for running a compliant organization, a compliance system, is how do you run a project in a compliant manner so that you're going to ultimately achieve this IT regulatory compliance. So the analog for proper compliant procedures is this consultative IT project governance. Again, how you go about doing things is the driver for everything that comes afterwards. If there's consultative project governance with compliance considerations and understanding that it's important that it's a risk, then you'll basically build a culture of compliance with IT in the business. It's not going to be something that's tacked on at the end. People are going to be aware that it's got to be baked into every succeeding step, and that the bar is actually getting raised higher. Scope of testing is even being extended. So while an ERP system in the past may have had one set of requirements to be addressed, now you've got serialization, much more comprehensive tracking and tracing involved, all sorts of new types of technology supporting that. So it's not getting any easier on top of outsourcing it. Again, if you're using compliance-based IT methodologies, you're having a discrete UAT and validation testing process, it's going to make things a lot easier to sort out how do I deal with issues as they come up and changes and unexpected requirements. IT methodologies that attempt to tack on the validation at the end without having it baked into the previous steps are just always going to be running into surprises and delays. Once you go live, obviously change management has got to be baked into the process as well. If you're dealing with agile methodology, that's even more important. If someone is trying to change a system while they've already validated a section of it that came before, we're talking about their UAT being a validation in the agile methodology, that you've got to really do some tough assessment of whether any future changes before you go live are going to affect previously validated or tested activities, this regression testing consideration, along with the updated SOPs and training. So if you've done this, the preceding steps from the bottom to the top, your updated SOPs and the training on those will happen naturally. And that'll contribute to your regulatory compliance. So they're all interdependent. It's not simple, but rarely do people step back and see, why did I get to this point? How did this happen to me? Why do I have to explain this to people? So the summary of all that is that with increases in system complexity, organizational flux that's going on with all sorts of changes in the life sciences industry, with different regimens being brought in by different parts of organizations that are either new to enterprises or changing methodologies and strategies, and outsourcing of many of these are in some ways eroding the traditional control models that underlie validation. So if you look at GAMP, they basically were focused on the expectations that people are following, COBIT or ITIL, and other well-defined standards for quality, and that they've got a fixed set of variables that are now controlled that they can validate. That's less and less the case. So it's increasing the pressures and the challenges in the validation. We still need to know that we have controlled, non-changing environments to do a validation. Increasing cost pressures and timelines are tending to shortcut governance. And ultimately, you want to have a cultural focus on compliance and best practice to prevent downstream validation issues originating at project inception. So it's all about validation readiness again. Putting a step in to actually assess validation readiness before you do your validation is very important. Often it's not done, and people basically think it's just a natural process of finishing the scripts and approving the scripts. The system may be way behind what the script expectations are. And if this isn't done, your cost of compliance will increase in terms of what does it take to get a signed off validation protocol and a final report. All these complexities and the lack of addressing them early will certainly take its toll late in the process. So with that, open to questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Larry. Appreciate the good information there. Lots to cover, you're right. And lots for all of us to continue learning here. We will open the floor to questions. And while you're typing those in, I would like to let you all know that the webinar has been recorded and will be available. You'll be able to see the slides and hear the presentation there by signing into the link that will be on our webinar, our website a little later today. And I'd also like to share with you that we understand by seeing the names on the attendee list here that many of you are very familiar with USDM and you're happy clients with our capabilities. But several of you are new to us, and I would like to share that we have 3 different delivery options. The first is our projects team, which supports a project start to finish. That's led by subject matter expert practice directors like Larry or other SME project managers, and it's utilizing the USDM team members with various skill sets. So based on a client preference, we can be very flexible with you, and we have the ability to work on-site or remotely. If you're just needing extra hands to help meet project deadlines, USDM can offer support through staff augmentation, and that's supporting the internally managed projects with the USDM solid team members, each offering skills and experience specifically needed for your project. And the goal there would be USDM client delight, resulting in repeat business and, of course, referrals. So the third option is USDM on demand. It's a blended on-site, onshore, offshore model, and that's for managed services, development, and support, and it's validation testing. So the approach there incorporates the cost savings of offshoring while reducing risk and ensuring higher success than traditional offshoring. So very good. Okay, the questions are coming, and the first one is from Todd asking, which are the technical documents that are most often neglected to be created in IT projects that you referred to?
That's a good question. Often what we're talking about is technical documentation related to environment management. Now again, some environments are more mature than others, so systems that have been around a long time, like an ERP system, may have these in place much more rigorously than a new cloud-based system or a system in an area of the company that is not yet really subject to validation. I do mention in the white paper, we didn't get into it here, that one of the factors we see in very mature companies that are now moving into new areas of automation, such as field service as an example. That's an area we've done a lot of work in, and in the past these areas were not fully automated, or were automated with very limited types of systems. Now we've seen a big push in the CRM space to integrate CRM, field service, ERP, etc. This is a cultural challenge for these organizations that haven't had to deal with this before. So when it comes to the IT group supporting them, they've never really dealt with it. So they may not have SOPs in place for dealing with the types of challenges that come with it, but more importantly, we see a lack of thorough design considerations related to data migrations, to the actual configuration of the system. We see very rudimentary and highly technical documents that aren't really something you want to put in front of an auditor without a lot of text. Often things related to the important integrations related to logging, Part 11 considerations mostly. So we often see these technical design processes being done without any awareness of Part 11 and what it's going to require in terms of being able to demonstrate recoverability, audit trails, things of that nature, really fundamental things. By the same token, configuration documents. So often the configurations are ad hoc. If you're doing an agile methodology, this may just be a natural part of the process that the people are sitting down in sessions and sort of winging it to configure systems. Well, at the end, we need a document that reflects the final state of the system so that we can show that it's configured as expected to meet the business requirements and the functionality you require. That is often not done. And needs to be, and is often done, late in the process when we say, where is it? And we see people scrambling to create them, design specs and configuration documents. So those are some of the biggest ones, and then SOPs right after that in terms of how the IT organization functions.
Very good. Thank you, Larry. Okay, the next question is from Joanne. What can be done to improve the awareness of IT departments around validation requirements?
Well, this this again is something that is USDM does a lot of work with. So usually, I mean, it starts with training and awareness. It requires a partnership between QA and validation and IT, and it starts with an acceptance of the fact that they are working in a regulated environment, that it's going to be a lot easier for IT to take these activities and bake them into their process and make them in line, as opposed to trying to deal with them at the end outside of an uninformed methodology, whether that's system development or data management, database management, the rest of it, especially when they're starting to deal with third-party vendors, cloud providers, and external hosting and SaaS providers. There's a very different type of relationship there. And it starts with training, and we have extensive, just to throw the plug in, we have an extensive training process to help IT organizations come up to speed. We have extensive libraries of SOPs from which organizations can choose to start getting them into best practice, and or at least having something that gives them guidelines as to what the best practice is. And then there's the ongoing support once you're there of being able to continually reinforce that in each project and anticipating it in each project. So it's not a one-day fix, but it's something that's done all the time. But it takes first a commitment to the fact that they don't want to keep doing it the same old way.
Okay. Very good. So our next question is from Deepa. She's asking, what is clean validation?
Well, for most people, a clean validation would be meeting the budget, doing it in the time allotted, and having as few deviations as possible at the end of the day. And having the execution be done by knowledgeable people who actually can execute the scripts appropriately, and having the right people available to answer questions, whether they be procedural, etc., at the time that you're executing. And then and the foundation for all that is what we've been talking about. So if those documents that the validation references are in place and are sufficient to meet the expectations of the requirement, then you're well on your way doing that. Again, it all starts with solid requirements. So unless someone's written them down, has a very good concept of what they are, whether they're in a combination of documents that are technical or conceptual, somewhere we have to distill testable, actionable requirements that are going to drive the entire validation. So it's all based on having requirements that meet your particular purpose, that we can demonstrate are being met, and then you're on your way to using it in production.
Thank you, Larry. Paul has a question for us. He's writing a paper on desktop virtualization migration of a validated computer. So is there a preferred library or document that would help him to research the topic?
Well, there's a lot out there. I would say that you need to first understand, the fundamentals of validation. I mean, there's a technical side and there's the validation side. So if this is a validated application, and of course not knowing anything about the context of what you're talking about, it's all based on fundamentals. So if you understand the process of validation and the testing that's expected to be done to demonstrate that migration is done in a sound manner, it all is about demonstrating that whatever changes are occurring do not perturb the underlying quality and outcome of the system that you're talking about. So the GAMP guidelines have many different information, and then there's ISO guidelines and others related to what goodness is and being able to define a methodology to do that if that's what you're doing.
Very good. I could also add, Paul, on our website, we do have several webinars that have been previously presented. IT virtualization, there's compliance in the cloud, different topics on migration. You might check those out and see if some of your questions or some of the data you're looking for, to write your paper might be a head start in those documents as well. We have a question from Richard. Can you differentiate between the scope of what you consider validation testing and UAT?
Again, it's very much dependent upon the context of the system you're talking about. Typically, a UAT is where you are fleshing out and smoking out all of the most detailed functional expectations of every field on a form, let's say, and its expected behavior under a variety of conditions, and as many permutations of that you've defined. Depending upon the nature of the subject matter that you're dealing with, you may not need to repeat that in the validation at the same level of detail. And in fact, certain scenarios that you may test in UAT because they are going to be used by the business may not have compliance implications, or will need much less testing to demonstrate its function than you would do in the UAT. But these need to be, if not completely different, then they need to be staged such that the vast majority of the bugs, misunderstandings, requirement omissions, things of that nature are smoked out well before the validation starts. So
right.
This is where you ensure that your validation is not going to run into a lot of unexpected things that just have to do with, is the system properly coded, does it meet the design specifications, and are the requirements actually correct?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Larry. I think we'll wrap up with the last question here from Antonio. With quality assurance and IT being in a partnership relationship, there are often conflicts with roles and responsibilities. How have you seen this successfully addressed? And Larry, I'll start off with just offering USDM, our team at large, when we are preparing to assist a client with a project, validation or otherwise, we have a meeting that really talks through the plan of attack or the plan of approach for every step of the project. This is done even while we're scoping the project and presenting our statement of work. Every step is defined as this is USDM, this is the client, this is the PM, this is the validation analyst, and every step is clear up front in the project, so then you can talk it through as you're planning and preparing for that. When questions or challenges, conflicts between the QA, the IT, the manufacturing, whoever is all trying to solve the problem together, it's usually the project manager that will come in and help to clarify roles and whose decision is this and who needs to make what happen, etc. Would you agree, Larry, or could you add more there?
Oh yeah, that's our role. Of course, we're subject to the authorities that, from a QA perspective and a validation perspective within our client, and we look to them to do the final sign-offs of whatever deliverables and activities we participate in that they're ultimately performing as well. So, within the organization, from an organizational perspective, within life sciences organizations, we've seen a variety of different types of structures, ranging from a corporate QA group that oversees everything and gets involved in everything, whether it's a system or whether it's in a piece of equipment, or we've seen delegation of that authority to subsidiary IT quality groups, and even an IT QA quality group. And there's a lot of controversy as to whether that's sufficient for a sign-off on an IT system, because if you have an IT QA group, they're still within the IT organization, and they may not have the right perspective to have an objective perspective on what needs to be done. So while an IT QA organization, if it's got its roles very well established, can help a lot with helping IT have that culture of compliance and to front end deliverables that come out of IT to go into for QA approval. One way or the other, there's always the need for good communication, working groups, steering committees, governance groups where they're all represented, and it starts with a charter. So a governance process starts with a charter and a definition of roles and responsibilities, and that's not easy to put together. But if that's not there, that's where you typically see people disagreeing about what forms to use, who can sign, is there an alternate to sign a document. Often we see signatures on documents cause weeks of delay in a project that weren't built into the schedule. So it is very important to get right, and we can advise on these organizational issues as well. But they're very unique to the culture of the organization and its history.
Absolutely. And, best plan is to prepare and solve the problem before it happens with communication up front, right? So well said, Larry. Thank you. With that, I think we will wrap up here. I would encourage you all to visit the USDM website, and you can find more information there around upcoming webinar events as well as the previously recorded sessions. We would invite you also to join us on LinkedIn. There's a USDM group page with good information for you as well. Thank you, Larry. We really appreciate you taking the time to present such good information. And all of you, let us know your feedback. We really do like to hear from you, making sure that we're on target, that the session was a good use of your time and helpful to you. If you have suggested topics for future presentations, we'd like to know how we can help you to solve your pain points. And of course, anything specific, just give us a call and we'll work with you one-on-one in solving issues as well. We appreciate the opportunity today to team with you all in working towards excellence and compliance. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day.